sit at the edge of summer. The heat has made its first entrance and then retreated, but still we know that this is the tipping point into summer. People are off hiking in the mountains and have plans for cooking out. And of course, Memorial Day also has its somber story. The complicated day of honoring our ancestors and grappling with the wars they fought. And we hold all of it. The summer season opening beautifully before us, and the history with its pain that we also carry. We come to church to stretch our hearts to be big enough to hold the difficulties and the sweetness all together, to honor the songs that last longer than the singers. Let it be hard and beautiful at the same moment, and let us not doubt our ability to hold all of it. John Morgenthau will light our chalice this morning, and I invite you to speak the words of the covenant. And when you look at your order of service, as you go to read the covenant, some of you may feel like you're behind by a week. I just had this vague sense that this is last week's order of service, and that's because some of you do have last week's order of service. The ushers will bring you this week's order of service. If you have last week's, just indicate to your friendly usher that you would like to be brought into the present moment. And to join in speaking the words of our covenant. Love is the doctrine of the church. Blessed for truth is the sacrament, and service is the prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve humanity in fellowship, to respect the nurturing power within all of us. Thus we covenant. And I invite you to join in singing Good Friend. The choir just sang it for us, and they will lead us in singing again. The words are not on the screen as this week's order of service indicates, but they are on this slip of paper, and you may find that you can just sing along. Memorial Day is one of these holidays that has roots that are older and more primal than we'll ever be able to describe. Humans have been honoring their dead, bringing gifts to those who have died for as long as we've been human. And in the United States, Memorial Day has a very particular version of that ancient story, which is that we remember people who have died in military service. Which means that we honor all the people who have participated in military service in this country and in other countries, knowing that there is a deep part of that story that is about loyalty and dedication and commitment, and we honor that deeply in our own religious tradition as well as in our civic traditions. So I would like us to take a few moments to honor the people in this congregation who have served or who have lost family members in service. And so I'll ask you to stand, and of course, as it always is here, if you don't wish to stand, even though I have named a group that you were a part of, you don't have to stand. But it is good to witness each other, to see each other's lives and notice the things about each other that we don't always talk about or honor. So first I say, who here has served in the military, or has served both in active duty or in less active duty? Thank you. Please stand if you are willing, so that we can see who among us has served. Thank you. And who has now, or has in the past, had a family member who has served in the military? Thank you. And who has had a family member killed or has had an ancestor killed in military service? and who has had a friend lost in military service. We lost friends together. And the truth is that probably there are more people here who have lost their ancestors in military service or in a war. We don't always keep all of that history. So you can see that most of us are connected quite directly to these stories of serving in our military and engaging in armed conflict and then trying to live in peace again. That is part of our story of being human together. Thank you for your service, for your dedication and your commitment.
From the earth in lofty flight, from the hills so green, in the blush of spring, so away with thee shall I fly, from this place to a land so far away. Softly now with the dawn, I will ride with the wind, for the hills so green, in the blush of spring. Spirit fly to a place on high. Spirit fly to a place above the sky. Spirit fly to a place on high. Softly now with the dawn, I go with thee. Softly now with the dawn, I will ride with the wind, o'er the hills through the mist, in the blush of spring. Spirit fly to the cloud up above. Spirit fly to a place beyond the sky. Spirit fly to a place on high. Softly now with the dawn, I go with thee.
And their leaders out to young church and hopefully out to garden beds in the yard. This reading is a short memory written by Reverend Paul Sawyer, who is one of my colleagues in the Unitarian Universalist Ministry, who's been serving in Heartland, Four Corners, Vermont for, I think, almost as long as I have been here. And his sister has sometimes been a member of this congregation, so we're all connected. Paul writes, The first time I ever played taps was at summer camp when I was 10 years old. That was the year I started playing trumpet. So I can only imagine how it sounded. I know there was no way I could have hit that high note near the end. The first time I played taps in honor of those who had died was in high school, when I was contacted by the local Legion commander. He asked if I would mind occasionally being called on to play taps at graveside services for veterans, and I agreed. For the next couple of years, when there was a need, I would take my place with the Legion Honor Guard, wait for the 3 volleys of shots to ring out, and then play the simple 24 notes of taps as clearly and as best I could. Each time the Legion commander would quietly slip me a $10 bill, and that was about all taps meant to me for a while. It was easy to do, it got me out of school, and I earned a little money. And then one day that changed. The man I was called upon to play for that day was the father of one of my Boy Scout leaders. Back then, like most of the adults I knew, I thought my assistant scoutmaster was pretty old. But his father was a World War II veteran, so thinking back, that means that both my leader and his father were actually relatively young. Too young for their places that morning as honored dead and grieving son. That day, as I began to play taps, this man, who I knew as wise and kind and relatively hard on the old Boy Scouts, wilderness leader sort of person, fell to his knees when I played taps, overwhelmed by tears. I'm not sure how I made it through the whole piece that day, but after that I thought I might not be able to play it again. Today, whether I'm playing it or hearing it, taps means something close to what it once meant, to the reasons for which it was written and originally used. Once upon a time, taps was a signal that the camp was safe, relatively safe. It meant that you were not under siege or under attack of any kind. It meant that you were reasonably sure that there were no enemy soldiers to worry about in at least a bugle's call distance away. To a whole camp of soldiers, the notes of taps meant, unless you're on duty, you could close your eyes. You could sleep in peace. I didn't know that story or that sentiment all those years ago when I played taps for pocket money in the local cemetery. But in that meaning of taps, something speaks to me in my heart and soul about dying, and for those of us who remain, about remembering well. I invite you into a time of meditation or your own practice of prayer. You may have this morning a name, someone on your heart whose memory or life you would like to meditate on. And you may have some very present, just unfolding today story in your own life. about which you need to sit here with this gathered company and simply breathe. I invite you to be here and breathe and hold however many people you need to in your heart that is here to be stretched. May this time of quiet deepen our compassion. Each of us has our part in the great song. Each of us gets to learn to sing our particular part of that song with as much gusto as we can. And we know that the song is always bigger than we are able to fully comprehend. And so it's good to join all our pieces of the song together so that we might catch just a glimpse of that song that is bigger than us, that song that outlasts us. So I invite you to speak some of your part of that larger song. If you have a little joyful rising bit of the song this morning, or a quiet mournful piece that you would like just to speak, please come forward and stand with me here up front. And I'll have the microphone so that we can hear your part of this last song.
Hello, I'm Erica, and I have a really big joy, which is that I'm graduating this time next Sunday. But that also means that I won't be around these parts for probably a fairly long time. So I'm going back to Texas for school and for life and my family and everything. So I will miss all of you a lot. And thank you so much for being a part of my family the past 3-4 years.
Lots of graduation stories this morning. I'm thrilled to say I have a recent college graduate sitting in the pew next to me. Anna graduated, and I know I'm gonna mess up her degree, but graduated from Georgetown University with a degree in international political economies. Did I get it right? And I'm also joined by a very long-time friend, Suzanne Harris, who's visiting a Unitarian church for the first time this morning. Conversion on the way.
I'm John Giglio. I have a little joy. My 12-year-old grandson, I learned, just got his middle school in Western New York, just got Student of the Year.
Good morning, I'm Paul Friedrichs. My life has many joys this month. One thing I wanted to mention, a joy, was reading President Obama's comments of Hiroshima, which I thought were amazing, and I hope everyone gets a chance to read them or hear them. But the bigger things in my life, all 3 of my children home this week. My 2 out-of-town kids, Emily from Buenos Aires, Argentina, where she was recently married in a civil ceremony, and we'll look forward to her planning her more full wedding next year here. And Peter, who's homesteading in his fixer-upper in Providence, and back here for a little rest and relaxation. And then my at-home kid will soon be a not-at-home kid. Leaf has graduated from UNH. We're celebrating him this weekend, before he goes on to a wonderful job opportunity in San Francisco this summer, and then grad school in Seattle this fall, all paid without his father's help. which we're all very proud of.
Hi. My full name is Leroy Wellwood Jones, and my father, Alfred Wellwood Jones, is very much on my mind. Towards the end of his life, he used to get Memorial Day and Veterans Day confused. And he would get upset with us if we didn't wish him a happy Memorial Day. And we would say, but Dad, you're still alive. He isn't anymore. He didn't die in a war, but he did die. At the beginning of World War II, he was a conscientious objector. As the war went on, he joined the Army Air Force as a civilian advisor. He was a mathematician. And he figured out, invented a slide rule, how to make bomb trajectories much more accurate so that we could kill more Japanese per bomb. I think this broke a part of him. From going to a conscientious objector to somebody who was maximizing lethality must have been very hard. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Rob Richards. I was remembering my father's story, who flew what was called a helldiver. He was a Navy pilot off of the USS Hornet. And my father was always a very lucky man, my mother used to say. And one day, a man showed up at our house, and I'd never met him before, and there was his family, and he told the story of how he was with my father in the plane. He was the navigator and the bomber, and how a fighter pilot was on their tail. It was a Japanese fighter pilot. And they didn't think they had much of a chance. But as this stranger told me, my father took them into the clouds. And he said, then and there I made a promise. And he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, that's when I made a promise that I would go into the church if we got out of this alive. And here I am, and I've been a minister ever since, he said. And your father saved us that day. Dad never talked. It's a hell of a thing to talk about the war, even if you're the son of someone who never could talk about it. The ripple effect goes on. But he was a lucky man, and so am I.
We come to church to have our hearts stretched so that we can hold all of it. The stories that can only now be spoken. And the stories that we tell over and over again, trying to fully comprehend them. I invite you to take a breath of peace with me. Peace for all of those who have lived with violence. which is all of us, because we are all touched by these stories. So take perhaps 3 breaths of peace to hold all that is here today. We hold each other in peace and love, and we keep learning to tell all the stories. This week, I was standing in the kitchen of the parsonage next door. I think I was getting my lunch ready, and Yvonne, our office administrator, came in and said, the usual casualness, "So, how does the pacifist honor the soldier?" This is why I love having you here. She's putting together the newsletter, announcements, news, and that is the question she is brewing on, and aware that is one of the tensions that many churches, and certainly Unitarian Universalist churches, grapple with on this Memorial Day. There are many of us, many of whom have served in active duty, who also want to put all of our energy toward peace, because that might be the best way to honor those who have died and those who have served. And how do we hold these two things together that can be hard to hold together? How do we make sure our hearts are big enough to hold all of it? Well, one of the ways that I begin to do that is to go back and find those origin stories, just like the reading from Paul Sawyer about where does taps come from? Why does that little song mean what it means to us, and why do we use it the way we use it? And then, after looking at where it started from, see how we live into it now. So one of the other stories that I try to remember every Memorial Day, and I know I've told this story before, but I find that I forget it, so I'll tell it again so that we'll all hold on to it. There are, of course, many origin stories for Memorial Day. It started in different places for different reasons, and they slowly converged until in 1971 it was declared a federal holiday. So that's either, depending on where you are in the time scale, that's either a fairly recent holiday or an old holiday. One of the early origin stories comes from the Civil War, when the war had ended and the African American people in the South were now free, or that story's complex too, so we'll just say they were now free. And some of the people in Charleston, South Carolina, knew that a number of Union soldiers had been held in a racetrack in their town and had died there and been buried without much dignity. And so thousands of African American people went to the racetrack and reburied some people and decorated the graves and had, in some ways, a funeral service there that hadn't been performed to honor the soldiers who had fought to free them. And it was at the same time a time to be grateful that the war was over, that the violence was ended, and that liberation had come. A complicated mix of honoring, setting things right, and in some way of celebrating that peace had come, and that peace had come with some reward for humanity. One historian said, this was the first Memorial Day. African Americans invented Memorial Day in Charleston, South Carolina. What you have there is Black Americans recently freed from slavery announcing to the world with flowers and their feet and songs what the war had been about. They were basically creating an Independence Day of a second American Revolution. And there were other Memorial Day honorings that are part of the origin stories of this day. But this is one that I think is easy to lose in our society. And I think it's good to keep telling it over and over again so that we remember that there is a distinctly African American piece of this day in which we stretch our hearts to hold as much as we can. So this early version of Memorial Day has this gratitude for the fight for liberation. It also holds this deep, as I said earlier, primal honoring of the dead. Honoring and remembering the dead in a very visceral way. Remembering that they are alive in us in ways that we probably can't fully understand. And this day is a day of honoring principles. In this case, it was the principle that human beings, living beings, should not be enslaved. And as we hear in some of the stories this morning, people fought in wars after that for other principles, to free people, to end totalitarianism. And we also know that as the wars of the 19th and 20th and 21st century have unfolded, the principles haven't always been as clear as we would like them to be. Sometimes the fighting has not been about setting people free. Sometimes the fighting has been about domination and profit and control. And then it gets difficult to figure out how to hold the soldier and the pacifist together. But it doesn't mean that we can't do it. It just means we have to work together to stretch our hearts. When I went and looked at some of the history of the song Taps, I learned that it was first used as a memorial song, as opposed to a "You Can Sleep Tonight" song. When a soldier had died, I believe in the Civil War, and they wanted to bury the soldier, but they were very close to the enemy still, and a bugle call or the firing of guns, as is traditionally done at a military funeral, would certainly have sparked fighting immediately again, and they wanted to be able to bury this soldier without inspiring fighting immediately. So the commander called for this song to be played instead. And in that moment, the war contained within it that creation of peace and rest and respect for human dignity that war seems so counter to. For a moment, that song, that melancholy, tender song, held both the person who had been killed in conflict and the soldiers who were honoring that lost person, and even those who were ready to fight again, in a moment of shared humanity, to honor our dead, to hold each other tenderly and to hope for peace. And it would appear that there was something so essential about that moment of playing that song instead of just firing guns over someone's funeral, that it stuck and has persisted to the present moment. You will probably hear those 24 notes of that song several times in the next day or two. And there's something, whatever words you might have in your head to hum along to that, to those notes, and there are quite a few different sets of words, just the notes themselves seem to touch into our humanity, into our sense that we are connected to each other in the midst of all manner of brutality. So when the pacifist and the soldier need to talk, that's a point of obvious connection, that no matter what has happened, we have our shared humanity and we do in fact belong to each other. I heard a journalist talking recently about the difficulty that soldiers have when re-entering civilian society. This is something that's been talked about in the past couple of years, and you may have heard, in fact, this journalist, Sebastian Junger, talking about this. I think he's telling this story because he thinks we need to know it, and I think he's right. He has been in combat situations as a reporter and has watched what it's like for soldiers, and then has talked to them when they're back in this world. And he reports being at a dinner party, in fact, with some soldiers, and a woman asking one of the soldiers if there was anything that he missed about the war. He was silent for a little while and said, "Ma'am, I miss just about everything about it." Which sets you back a bit. But he wasn't saying that he missed the fighting, wasn't saying that he missed the possibility that he might die at any moment. This journalist, Sebastian Junger, thinks that what he really misses is the sense that that soldier was completely connected to the people in his unit, that they relied on each other utterly. This journalist calls it brotherhood. You have to find another word. It's hard to find the right words for these things. And he says brotherhood is different from friendship. Friendship has to do with if you have things in common and if you get along and how you feel about each other, but brotherhood is the absolute commitment that you will take care of each other no matter what. That you will rely on each other, and you know you can rely on each other through anything. That you would give up your life for the other people in your group. And that is such a powerful experience, that when people come back from war and are then in society where the government, who has agreed to care for them after they fight, can't quite figure out how to do that. So they're pretty clear that they can't depend on the system that said it would help them. And then they're in families and churches and all sorts of situations where they're not sure if people will really care for them and if they can actually rely on each other, and if they'll be able to help other people in the way that they want to, given the traumas that they've come through. So they are in the middle of war, which is a horrible violence, and in the center of the war is held this sense of belonging to each other. And then they leave that and come back to this situation of peace and aren't sure if they belong to any of us. It's a terrible bind for the soldier and the people trying to live in peace to meet each other. And it is that belonging to each other that we need most in the world. And it is, I think, part of why we get into these violent conflicts, that we're trying to figure out how we belong to each other. Is it just people in our country who belong to each other, and so we have to fight other people who belong to each other? Do we fight on other people's behalves because they belong to us? I don't have answers to those questions, but you did hear it from Obama's visit in Japan this week a little bit. He talked about how various countries have participated in the violence of trying to dominate each other, and that trying to come back from that. Another sort of ancient primal urge to dominate each other, and find this other just as essential quality of knowing that we belong to each other is the work of our lives now. The reason that people in war can remember that they belong to each other is partially because they get trained, and partially because the intensity of the situation is so high that it strips away a whole lot of pretense about preferences and whether you agree about things and who said the right thing and who said the wrong thing. And sometimes when people get left alone and bored for too long, that stuff comes back up. So in our daily lives, when we like to pretend things aren't that intense, we can get distracted by the most superficial parts of our lives. What we look like, how we present on a given day, what we like about things, particular quirks and mannerisms, and push each other away and forget that we belong to each other. So maybe we just have to play taps every day. Find those things that just sneak past all of our thinking and protections. Just get around the side of that and touch into that place where we remember that we do belong to each other. I think that's what my colleague was hearing when taps moved him so much at that cemetery for the first time, when he watched his mentor, this very old man, who he thought had all kinds of experience and strength and capacity, and he watched that man melt with grief and with the awareness that we do belong to each other and sometimes we lose each other. And also in that song, the longing for safety, for an end to dangers, for peaceful sleep in a world that feels so threatening. And so it is that our peaceful world holds alienation, and the military, this system of aggression in our world, carries within it a tender song that reminds us of the deep human need for peace and lives of dignity and belonging. Observed to me this week that one of the simplest definitions of religion is memory and hope, which is what I almost always say about lighting candles up front. We wish to light a candle this morning during the offering time for a memory, or a hope, for a name, for a story. Please do. This offering time is part of how we both sustain ourselves in this present moment and how we keep the resources so that we can keep telling a new story. So we can go back, pick up the old threads, and then come forward with a new version of the story that we can live into. This is part of how we keep claiming that we do belong to each other, even if we forget sometimes. Please do light candles this morning during this offering time. The morning offering for the ways that we belong to each other will now be received. Please remain standing and keep singing hymn 163, For the Earth Forever Turning. Put out the light of the chalice in this room, but take that spark with you. Honor the singers and honor the song that outlasts each of us. Please join in the unison benediction. It is printed in the order of service. Go in peace.
Give thanks each day, and respect the earth and all creatures,